welcome to the second of our 2 webinars focusing on how ESG is interpreted within some of the core real estate markets across Europe and beyond. The first of our webinars focused on the E, and this webinar is going to focus on the S and the G. Generally speaking, I think we discovered during the first webinar that the E is quite well understood in the key real estate markets, whereas the S and the G perhaps is less clear. It may be that it's becoming more clear though, and I think that's the kind of thing we're going to explore today and learn more about. Today we have a number of OC lawyers joining us from countries across Europe and worldwide to help us understand what the S and the G means in their markets. And so before we launch into our discussions, I will introduce everyone. So we have Anastasia Gorokova from the UK. We have Casper Bos from the Netherlands.
Hello, everyone.
Hi. We have Anna Isabel Lozano from Spain.
Hello.
We have Frank Klaas from Belgium.
Hello, everybody.
We have Roberto Salis from Italy.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. We have Jan Herman from Germany.
Hello, everybody.
We have Frank Olivier from France.
Hi, everyone.
Agata Demuth from Poland.
Hello.
And Veena Krishnan from India.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, thanks everyone. So I think let's launch into the discussions now. We've sort of introduced the topic and everyone who's participating today. I wanted to first explore some of the trends that we're seeing on the S and the G and how these are being seen or perhaps not being seen in the various jurisdictions. So the first trend that I wanted to look at was affordable housing and urban renewal. And maybe we could start with Belgium. Is this something you're seeing in your market, Fran?
Yeah, thanks, Annie. Yeah, it is. It's in Belgium, it's a really pressing issue, actually. There's a much higher demand as there is a supply, and government initiatives are not sufficient. So I see that it's becoming a really developing market. A lot of real estate players are directing themselves towards this market. And as an example, we see that in Brussels right now, there's such a big residential shortage, which is due to historic low level of permits, which are now delivered. While we need at least 2,400 units a year to be added to the market, there's only 800 built. So it's a really pressing issue, and luckily investors are going for that market, but it takes time. That's for sure.
Thanks, Fran. That's really interesting. And Anastasia, in the UK, are we also seeing this affordable housing and urban renewal a strong trend?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the government is quite clear about the targets that it wants to hit in terms of affordable housing, and you see more and more investors moving into this space. So we supported M&G Real Estate recently on the launch of their shared ownership fund, for example. So they're really, sort of trying to get into this market as well.
Thank you. And Veena, in India, I hear that there's quite a lot going on the sort of affordable housing side with grants and various affirmative action measures by the government. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. Given our high population, there is a lot of demand for affordable housing. And the government has schemes for economically weaker sections as well for affordable housing. And there are a lot of government policies on this aspect. There are affirmative actions by the government for socially weak sections as well. And there are several tax exemptions and incentives for purchasers and developers in the affordable housing sector. So yes, there is a lot of activity going on in this sector in India.
Right, that's really good to know. Thanks, Veena. And Roberto, I wanted to come to you. In Italy, I know that there's this relatively new entity structure called benefit companies. I wondered whether you could maybe mention that and anything else that's going on in the affordable housing sort of side.
Yeah, the benefit companies were introduced in Italy in 2015, and they are a new kind of type of benefit of companies, because a benefit company is a company which have a social objective. It means the benefit company has to bring a positive impact to the surrounding environment and the community. And nowadays in Italy, there are a trend for the asset manager of the ordinary companies to transfer their companies into benefit companies. Because this is useful in terms of securing finance for the companies and secure investments, as the market and consumer find these very attractive, and also in relation with the supply accreditation.
Okay, thank you. So we can see from lots of the jurisdictions then that affordable housing is actually, becoming a real trend and something we're seeing a lot of. Agata, in Poland, though, my understanding, and it'd be just interesting to hear briefly from you, that perhaps affordable housing isn't something that's necessarily working well at the moment. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the Polish residential market is booming at the moment, although the demand of affordable housing is much higher than the supply. Local authorities are obliged to provide housing for those people who cannot afford the market rent or market prices. Although, again, there's shortage of such apartments being available. There were certain programs introduced by the government dedicated to individuals to provide them with some incentives concerning acquisition of their own apartments, although they were not very successful. There were also some attempts concerning residential projects being conducted in a sort of public-private partnership. Again, not very successful. So there is a need of private investors to enter the market, but at the very moment they are hardly visible. The market is booming, so they opt for more profitable projects than affordable housing. And well, there is a lot to be done on the Polish market in this respect.
Okay, thanks. That's really interesting to hear sort of how, it's not necessarily the same in all jurisdictions, and that's obviously something where there's, as you said, some work to be done in Poland on that. I'm going to move now on to a second trend that I wanted to explore, and this is health and well-being in terms of building design. And maybe starting with you, Frank-Olivier, in France, are you seeing health and well-being as a trend that's emerging when looking at the S and the G?
Yeah, in France, it's a very strong trend led by the funds on one side, but also the movement is really initiated by the occupiers themselves, in fact. Two quick examples on French side. We are advising a major French tank company on the negotiations of their commercial lease in future state of completion, but their new head office premises headquarters, in fact, in the very center of Paris. And side tech company asked the landlord to build a basketball and a football court within the premises instead of having more office space for their employees. So it's a really strong trend led by occupiers. On the funds side, one example is also noteworthy in France. Gecina, a major investment fund in France, has developed since 2017 a certification named the WELL. The WELL certification, in fact, recognizes buildings within their portfolio or outside their portfolio, which are meeting criteria, approximately 100, essential, but to employee well-being, which are related to air, water, nutrition, light, physical activities within the premises, comfort, and also their spirit. So it's a really strong trend in France.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting. And Anastasia, in the UK, are you seeing health and well-being sort of rise up the agenda?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it sort of is hand in hand with this idea of community, which is really becoming a really big trend, and I think has become even more so during lockdown. I think if you look at certain sectors within the real estate market, particularly the operational residential areas, built to rent, student accommodation, for example, co-living, which already have quite a big focus on amenity and providing, yoga classes to the residents and connecting people via apps so that people can chat to each other and alleviate loneliness and that type of stuff. I mean, I think, it was really the time to shine for those types of assets, during lockdown from a health and well-being perspective, because all those other amenities that were kind of, nice to have, really became front and center of what these types of assets have to offer. And then if you also look at bigger schemes that we're working on a lot at the moment, sort of bigger regeneration schemes, large sort of long-term phase projects, you see a lot more emphasis on, green spaces, allotments, everybody pulling together to sort of do something together. You have a big open space in the middle, with fountains to get families together to, this type of stuff. I mean, it's really feeding all the way through, right from planning right to delivery of these big projects.
Great, thanks. That's really good to hear. Thanks, Anastasia. And in Poland, Agata, what are you seeing in health and well-being? Are you seeing that the trend's more visible in certain markets, or what are you seeing?
This trend is very, very much visible on the office market and the residential market. With respect to the residential one, we have quite an interesting situation, because the trend as such was first visible in the 60s and 70s of the previous century, when the housing communities were built in a way to include various facilities, school, kindergartens, markets, etc. Then in the 90s, the trend was reversed, and the residential investors who entered the Polish market, they were more focused on profit than well-being of Polish citizens. However, now the trend is reversed again, but mostly in a sort of, let's say, more affluent neighborhood. So there are spaces for children to play, some places for adults to meet, some places open to the local communities, rooftop gardens, etc., etc. And with respect to the office market, the institutional investors, they do pay attention to and implement some very interesting solutions concerning green area planting, meeting sites, places available for local communities, places for children, gyms, etc. They also they pay very much attention on the fit out, which is much more user friendly than it used to be, even when talking about open spaces. So there are also some places for sort of quiet work, quiet leisure, etc. And similar to Spain, I think, the first WELL certificate in Poland was introduced in 2017, which was like five years ago. However, now we have buildings or places which are even double certified, which means that there is a separate certificate for a building and a separate certificate for particular premises. And this trend is getting more and more popular.
Thank you. And finally, before we move on to the next trend, Veena, in India, how is health and well-being sort of being seen in your market, or not seen?
Actually, from a statutory and government perspective, we do have a lot of health and well-being built into our laws. For instance, if you're developing a layout, be it commercial, industrial, or residential, a certain percentage has to be reserved for parks and open spaces. And we also have this concept of civic amenities, which could mean a school or a local grocery store or a place of worship, etc. And therefore, the emphasis is to make sure that it's not a concrete jungle. And in the private sector, where there are no technical specifications as such, the projects are structured such that it is again not a concrete jungle. There is enough space for greenery, for walk, for yoga, for schools, etc. And for certain projects above a certain extent of square meters, we have central government environmental approval, which is mandatory. And those conditions are pretty stringent in terms of constructing the building in accordance with energy conservation measures, making sure that it's constructed in such a way as it is cool inside, solar water heating, and many other provisions. And managing waste within the premises is like almost mandatory. No one is allowed to really send out their waste, and wastewater recycling and utilization within the premises is also mandatory now.
Okay, that's great. So lots going on in India on the health and well-being side, which is good to see. So moving on to the third trend that I wanted to explore, and this is all about supply chain management and looking at it in terms of it in a way that it supports the S and the G. So I suppose an ESG friendly supply chain. Anastasia, let's go to you first for the UK. How much of a focus on an ESG friendly supply chain at the moment?
Yeah, so it's it's hard, I think that Brexit and COVID have definitely had an impact on supply chains. It's there's delays, there's increased costs, so that is kind of the day-to-day challenges that people are facing when it comes to supply chains. So it does, fitting it into an ESG agenda is harder because you're just trying to actually just do your day-to-day job. But I think there are and we are seeing some really good ways of getting the supply chain point into a kind of an ESG strategy. So, for example, a couple of years ago, they introduced the idea of social value as a kind of tangible criteria for when you're bidding for sites. So, if you're bidding for a site that's being sold by a public authority, by a local authority, or sort of a government body, that there's a competitive process to go through to get that site. And as part of that process, up to 10% of the score that each of the bidders can be given can be for social value, if they can demonstrate that they'll deliver social value as part of that project. And social value can be so many different things. And one of the main things that people are putting into that social value bucket is supply chain. So they're going to use local suppliers, they're going to use maybe local workforce, local employers, local maybe apprenticeship schemes with local businesses and things like that. And that's where it can really kind of actually have a tangible positive effect, because you are kind of, you are making your case for that 10% much stronger by using that local supply chain. So we see a lot more of that in these larger schemes. But yeah, as I say, I mean, it just remains on a day-to-day basis, it really remains a challenge at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you. And Fran, in Belgium, are you seeing a sort of similar challenge, I suppose?
Yeah, I can really relate to what Anastasia is saying. So the focus is currently really on pricing and not on the ESG supply chain management. It's because COVID is still lingering. It's also because of the Ukrainian war impacting access to what is affordable materials, and we see huge price rises and shortages of these materials. So the emphasis is really currently not on building a more ESG friendly supply chain. So it became a bit, it's on the back burner, that's for sure. Clients are more concerned about construction prices, delivery schedules, and that's just in a time when the industry actually wants to resume delayed developments. And I think that the industry is currently struggling with that impact of the supply chain disruptions, the surging energy costs, labor shortages, and the big question is, how long will these issues last? So it's really on the back burner.
Real difficulty, and real challenge.
But there is also something that applies in France, as Anastasia said, for the UK, is a specificity regarding the public procurement. You can implement. She mentioned the social value, but in France, you can a local body, the government may implement a social criteria where a certain percentage of, for example, people with disabilities need to be employed in order to grant a specific contract. So it's a bit something what we see in Western Europe, yes.
Okay, thank you. And before we move on to our next trend, Veena, in India, what are you seeing around the supply chain management?
As far as supply chain management is concerned in India, it is largely driven by statutes. So the only mandate is to be statutorily compliant. But you do have some stringent legislation, such as we have laws relating to management and disposal of hazardous waste. And those are actually made a part of the building approval conditions. It's like when you're constructing, these mandates are set out in your building license. And there is also a lot of movement against illegal mining of sand from rivers. So that is also prohibited, and therefore manufactured sand alone can be used in construction of buildings. This is just to give an example.
Okay, thank you. I think that's really interesting, and I think it's quite clear that there are some challenges at the moment in getting ESG embedded into supply chain management. But maybe we will start to see that move in the near future. Who knows? So moving on to our penultimate trend, which is all about community engagement. Anastasia, starting with you, how are you seeing community engagement sort of come across in this sort of ESG conversation in the UK?
I mean, I think as part of the planning process in the UK, it's always been, part of what developers do. They engage with the local communities. I think it's it's becoming increasingly important. I think people are starting earlier, you know, especially with the focus now on much more larger schemes, more long-term schemes. It's so much more important to know that what you're going to be delivering over the next 5, 10, however many years is going to really resonate with local residents. So yes, there's a increased emphasis on it for sure.
Okay, thank you. And Frank-Olivier, in France, if my understanding is correct, it's more about the internal policies of, say, the tenants and the landlord, is it, than anything, you know, legally or law-based?
No, completely right. There's no specific laws or regulations on the French legislation impacting or committing for a specific community engagement. It's more about tenants and or landlords engagements, whether they are submitted to ESG criteria, if they're reporting to their stakeholders, but it's more about internal policy. You're completely right.
Thank you. And Agata, in Poland, interested to hear sort of how it's coming through in your jurisdiction, in your market.
We also don't have any specific regulations, so all initiatives, they are based on internal policies of the investors. Although they are becoming more and more popular on the Polish market, and the investors, they are getting more concerned about the local communities living next to the investment. So they propose or they provide various programs like food markets, holiday time entertainment, and some other activities to happen in the publicly available places of the investment. On the other hand, there is a high increase of mixed-use investment in Poland, and also of revitalization of the areas which have been neglected some time ago. And this also provides opportunity to involve the local communities in various social events which happen in such places. They are usually revitalized or mixed use, which places which are publicly accessible, like museums, restaurants, cafes, etc. So that's a good and very visible trend in Poland.
That's really good to hear. Thank you very much. And just closing up on this trend, Veena, in India, I'd be really interested to hear a little bit about this mandatory CSR regime, which I've heard about.
Yes, so in India, companies are mandated to reserve a certain portion of their budget towards corporate social responsibility, which is essentially funding community activities, could be tree planting, could be supporting government schools, providing infrastructure, etc. But this mandate is quite detailed, so it's not enough if you simply donate money to an NGO. It will have to be donated for a specific purpose if that is happening, and it will have to be followed through and ensured that the activity is completed, because there are a lot of compliance and audit requirements on this aspect as well.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So our fifth and final trend that I just wanted to explore briefly is a focus on equality and diversity. So Anastasia, in the UK, what are we seeing on this?
Yeah, you know, massive emphasis. I mean, most of our clients, I think, have got a diversity and inclusion policy. I think, you know, there's no, you know, it's still the real estate industry is still very male dominated, particularly at a senior level. I mean, I think that is changing, which is great. I mean, I think the only thing to mention is that, you know, most people will know that any business above a very small business have to report on the gender pay gap and how much, you know, men and women are paid. And it's sort of, you know, it's obviously publicly disclosable. So, you know, that is good. I think that transparency is really helping.
Thank you. And to close off on this trend and our trends section generally, Jan, I'm interested to hear from you. In Germany, I understand you've got a couple of sort of client examples of what's actually going on in terms of diversity inclusion and how this is being seen in your market.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much, Anna. Yeah, I'd like to briefly introduce two client examples which underline the awareness of the social criterion. And one of them is we have discovered that in Germany it's very hard for female founders to raise capital, especially venture capital. And this is why we are structuring a female VC fund for Tijen Onaran. She's a very famous German author and moderator, and she is acting for diversity. And this VC fund has its investment focus on startup companies which have a 50% plus female management or even female founders. And the second example, it's not necessarily diversity, but it has another quite important social criterion. It's a fund which invests in the reforestation in sub-Saharan African countries, especially in Angola. And what they do is they open up or acquire local project companies, and they provide management and know-how to these project companies. But also, and that's where the social criterion comes in, they are establishing appropriate working conditions in these project companies and creating jobs for local people who can work in the project companies and and support with the reforestation in their own country.
Great. Thanks so much. That's really interesting. It's just really nice to hear some sort of real life examples of how Osborne Clarke specifically are involved in this kind of thing. So that's great. Thank you. So that was really good. I think that we've explored some of the key trends that we're seeing. I just want to move on now, quite briefly, to the key drivers for change in the S and the G in terms of what is actually causing and bringing about these trends and these changes. So I'm just going to go to each of the jurisdictions, just for a headline point in terms of where you think this change and drive is coming from. So starting with Anastasia for the UK.
Definitely investor driven, 100% investor driven. It's much top down, not so much sort of policy and government driven, and I can't see that changing.
Okay, thanks. And Belgium, what are we seeing there?
Yeah, it's actually both, but mainly investor driven also. But it's also driven by other drivers, such as, for example, millennials, young people demanding S and the G value from their living environment, and they're quite influential. They want living as a service with everything there, well-being, co-living, communal areas, car and bike sharing, etc. So it's investor driven, but they're also other very important drivers in the market.
Thanks, that's really interesting. And Casper, how about in the Netherlands?
It's of course always a mix of the different parties involved, but I would say it's mainly driven from the government, who requires, for instance, a certain amount of social housing in larger projects, and imposes the obligation on developers to encourage the local residents to be involved in project development. So mainly governmental, but of course always a mix.
Thank you, of course. And Roberto, how about in Italy?
In Belgium, I'd say that it's both government and investors driven, but it can be different across the regions in Italy, because there are a lot of difference across all the regions in Italy, from the north to the south. And the regions in the north of Italy are much more focused on the social housing, for example, and investors agree to provide, for example, a certain percentage of social housing, or to guarantee affordable rents. And for the logistic, I'd say it's driven by the market, because it depends also across the regions, because there are regions that are much more populated in the north than in the south.
Okay, thank you. And Anna Isabel, where are you seeing this drive in Spain?
Well, here government and investors are driving changes, maybe mostly government. And as with Italy, it differs across the regions because of different regulations applicable. In this regard, it should be noted that the House and Draft Bill includes some specific measures in this regard, as a mandatory reserve of 30% of any development for subsidized housing, or even in stressed housing market areas and with respect to certain landlords. It also includes some price controls for rents.
Thank you. And Frank-Olivier, in France, what are the main drivers over there?
As said earlier, main drivers are the government and the investors. The government is putting so much pressure on the on the local authorities to build social housing to implement affordable rents so that everyone can rent an affordable housing. So definitely the government, but as Franz said earlier, also regarding office premises, it's in fact the market and the occupiers, i.e. the millionaires she mentioned,
Yep.
that are putting so much pressure on their employee, so that in fact the companies have to retain to be very attentive to these matters, to attract, retain new talent within their premises. So in fact, directly they are putting so much pressure on the landlords. So in fact, driven of course by the government on the resi side, but on the office and retail aspects, it's driven by the occupiers that are pushing on the landlords.
Okay, thank you. And Agata, how about in Poland?
We have two key drivers for the change. These are obviously investors and a social demand of young, more conscious customers, mostly 30 plus, who do care about ESG. Yeah.
Thank you. And Veena, in India, what are you seeing?
Similar to what Agatha said, in India as well, it is a lot investor and customer driven, where voluntarily ESG policies are being developed. And you also have a trend where a lot of non-traditional real estate players are entering the market. Like I have a client who is an affordable housing company and which is promoted by a bunch of IT professionals. And therefore, their approach is quite different, not like the typical real estate approach. They want an all-round development for the company. And yes, therefore, there's a lot of focus on the ESG policy.
Okay, thank you. And then finally on this, Jan, just briefly in Germany, where's the drive coming from for change?
I think it's generally a rapidly increasing sustainability awareness in the market. And I mean, just in the other jurisdictions, it is both investor and government driven. It's just that the investors are quicker than the government.
Yeah. Thank you. So finally, now that we've looked at the trends and we've looked at what the drivers are for change, I just wanted to finish on the impact on client businesses, because obviously, you know, how it's affecting those in the market is really the crucial thing in all of this. Just briefly, Anastasia, in the UK, what are you seeing in terms of impact on our clients?
I think it's just trying to reconcile the investor pressure, as I mentioned, with trying to actually formulate an ESG strategy that then works, because investors are demanding particular results, but it's not always easy with the planning system and land prices and different types of competitors in the market. It's not always easy to implement that ESG strategy in the way that those investors want and to see that return. So I think that's the challenge that our clients are facing at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And how about in Italy?
I think that the companies in the recent years had to improve their ESG credential, also to participate to public tenders and to win public contracts because of the focus on the ESG models. For example, all the companies had to adopt the so-called 231 model, which is a guideline on the rules of conduct to be observed or avoid in order not to commit certain specific crimes, which give rise to other crimes that are relevant at a corporate level, for example, or in order to provide to the authority the anti-mafia documentations that is always requested in the public tenders in Italy, also because it's local here, I think. And this is having a direct impact on our client as well, and that indirect impact on the whole market here in Italy. So I think they are very important now.
Okay, thank you. And just conscious of time, I think we'll probably need to wrap things up very shortly. We could probably continue to talk about this for, there's lots to talk about for a long time, but I know from discussions I've had with Veena, you said that in India it's actually highly compliance driven in terms of impacts on clients. So you just end up complying with the laws and requirements. And I know in Poland, Agata, you've said that actually you think interestingly it'll be the investors that will be providing us with the the criteria to properly assess S&G in the future, which I think is really interesting. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for your contributions. I think that's been a really, really useful discussion, and rounds off the ESG discussion across the two webinars in terms of what we're seeing in the market, what are the trends, how these are impacting our clients, and what direction of travel we see. So thank you to everyone. I think it's quite clear that E is still probably the more tangible, measurable, and perhaps more importance is placed on it. But I think S&G is climbing up the agenda, and we are getting an increased understanding of it and placing more importance on it. So thanks so much. We hope that everyone who is listening has enjoyed it as well. And thank you and goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.